basically, let me start with economics and its view of the future. So, it's sometimes known as the dismal science, also for the wrong reasons. And certainly recently it's had its share of alarmist and pessimist predictions of stagnation and economic decline. And among the many alarmist predictions that I've seen in my lifetime, I've seen a lot of them, and many of them are not perfectly consistent. For instance, we have overpopulation and Malthusian disasters, which were the sort of rage in the 1950s and 1960s. And now we have the reverse, namely underpopulation, population aging, and fertility decline. You can't have both, I imagine, but they're both scary things. There is a fear of resource exhaustion, and of course the environmental disasters that go with it. There is a concern that the welfare state, which certainly in Europe we love, is unsustainable. There is, as already mentioned, the fear of secular stagnation and insufficient aggregate demand, and of course climate change, sort of the mother of all disasters, which is being debated as we speak. More recently, and that's the issue I want to talk about, the question has been raised whether the technological momentum that we have experienced in the last 150 years can be sustained. So I think everybody agrees that, say, since 1800 or 1850 or so, technological progress and innovation have been the main engines of economic growth. And the question is, can we keep that up? And there's been some kind of doubts about that. Perhaps the most eloquent and learned spokesman of that has been my much admired but misguided colleague, Robert Gordon, who basically has gone on record in a number of places essentially saying that what he termed is the low-hanging fruits of inventions have all been picked. And so future inventions, he and others have said, will not be nearly as radical as what we have experienced. And so the prediction is that innovation and productivity growth will not be sufficiently powerful to counter these headwinds that we're all facing, and annual GDP growth and productivity and all these other things that go with it will slow down to a trickle in the foreseeable future. And so here is a famous picture that many of you will remember from The Economist magazine, basically saying, you know, has the ideas machine broken down? Is innovation really reaching some kind of dead end? Now, as I said, Gordon is not alone. Here is a very famous entrepreneur, Peter Thiel, of PayPal fame and many other things. He just put a big op-ed in the New York Times yesterday in which he advocated return to nuclear power, for those of you interested in this thing. And so his famous remark is, we were hoping for flying cars, but what we got instead was 140 characters. To which I would reply, wait until you need a hip replacement, buddy, and you'll see what technology has done in the last 10, 15 years. I had one, and I can tell you. But still, is the world running out of ideas? And, you know, what we've seen in the 20th century clearly are changes that have really altered our quality of daily life more than anything we've seen in the entire integral of history from the very beginning until, say, about 1900. Think of all the things that have come up, you know, all the way from air conditioning, electricity, chlorination of water, antibiotics, on and on and on. Things that have really changed the material conditions of our life more than anything else. What I would answer to that is that, yes, maybe the low-hanging fruits have been picked. But just to pursue this metaphor a little bit, isn't it true that science's main function is to build taller and taller ladders so that we can get to the higher-hanging fruits, and, of course, maybe to plant newer and maybe improved trees? I don't want to beat this metaphor into the ground, you know, because, but you can sort of see what I'm driving at. And so maybe the old fruits can be made to sprout new fruits. enough of this sort of agricultural metaphor. Now, as opposed to these pessimists, there is, of course, another stream of hyper-optimists who basically argued that, it's not just that we're going to see no secular stagnation, but in fact, the rapid improvements in computation, in particular artificial intelligence and robotics, have the potential to increase productivity and breadth to the point where human labor may become, in fact, increasingly superfluous. Of course, what I'm talking about here is a group of futurists around the idea of singularity proposed by MIT futurist Ray Kurzweil, in which machines not only replicate themselves, but are actually capable of what is known as recursive self-improvement. So here's Ray Kurzweil, whom I'm actually going to meet next week. I've never met him before, and warning that the singularity is near. I think this is not a real thing. This is somebody's idea of a joke, but I actually don't know how this photograph was made, but I plan to ask him. But this issue, of course, is real. Here is a quote from an economist, in fact, a former teacher of mine, who's basically made a very, I would say, optimistic prediction about the productivity of computers and software, and that these are going to take over more and more human tasks, moving from calculations to search, to speech recognition, psychotherapy, and robotic activities on the road and on the battlefield. And so it's possible, that machines will eventually acquire the skills and intelligence of the human brain itself. Now, if that's true, of course, then the notion that the low-hanging fruits have all been picked cannot be. One of the two must be true. Now, for many people, this is actually not so optimistic. They would think of this Nordhaus, Kurzweil kind of view of the future as more of a dystopian prediction. And maybe it's even worse than secular stagnation, if we end up in a world like, Kurt Vonnegut described in his famous novel, Player Piano, in which basically everything's done by machines and people have nothing to do. But, if you start thinking about it, economists have known for a long time that this singularity that Kurzweil's talking about and this sort of machine rule isn't all that terribly likely. What Nordhaus argues, I think correctly, is that computer intelligence and human intelligence are really good at quite different things, and that in the terms of economics, they're more likely to be complements than substitutes. That is to say, they will work together, reinforcing each other rather than replace each other. What my view is basically very much like that artificial intelligence and computers and robots, rather than becoming our masters, will help us understand nature better and dominate it even more than we have in the past. And this is a point I will come back to. So the big question is, quo vadis technology? Where are we going to go technology? And so I'm an economic historian, and the question is, what will an economic historian bring to this kind of debate? So let me be, for those of you who are going to fall asleep now or going to go home, here's the take-home line. If the patterns of the past hold, which is a big if, there's good reason to expect that the rate of technological change to accelerate over the next 2 decades. Now, I will be foolhardy to be more specific than that. I will not tell you where we're going to go, but to sort of summarize it all in this sort of American colloquialism is, if you ask my view about the future of technology, my answer would be very brief. You ain't seen nothing yet. Now, you may also want to recall what is sometimes known as Amaras Law. So Roy Amara was a past president of something called the Institute of the Future and a futurologist. And this is his most famous dictum. We tend to overestimate the effect of a new technology in the short run and underestimate its effect in the long run. I will be talking about the long run, and I think it's very important for me to set the record straight on what technology is going to do in the long run. And so my argument will be that, yes, there are headwinds in the aging of population, in a whole bunch of other things that we all know and love, but the tailwind from what I call useful knowledge. This is a term I like. It's an 18th century expression that is kind of confusing today, but I basically mean science and technology with that. But that the tailwind of useful knowledge will be so powerful, like a tornado, that it will overcome all the headwinds of population aging and resource exhaustion and climate change and everything else. Now, can I be sure? Of course not. But I'm going to try to make the argument using history, and you will be the judges. So what my methodology will be today is to look at the sources of European success in useful knowledge, roughly speaking, between 1600 and 1850, although I can't guarantee I'll stay within those limits, and see if those factors hold in some ways for today as well, and then hope that I haven't left any sort of what we call in economics omitted variables that would ruin the equation. It's not proof. In this kind of game, you don't prove things. There's no QED at the end. I can try just to make a plausible argument, and then you can argue with it. So what can we learn from the past then? So I'm going to say something about the major and social changes that drove all this. And that is, as I have argued in the previous book, the European Enlightenment of the 18th century, what you call in Italian l'Illuminismo. And the Enlightenment, as I have long argued, is the main factor that helped Europe attain the kind of advantage that made it the leader of the world in some ways for a very long time, and in some ways Europe and its European offshoots still do that. But it's important to emphasize what precisely I have in mind here. What slice of the Enlightenment am I interested in? And so I have used the term, and this is a term I invented, and it'll probably be forgotten, but it's a useful term. I call it the Industrial Enlightenment. It's different from the Industrial Revolution because it's a purely cultural phenomenon. But it's basically based on three propositions which are essentially self-evident to us and were anything but, say, in 1650. Okay? And the three propositions are the following. One, material progress, or what we would call today economic growth, has happened in the past and is therefore possible, which in 1650 surely was an audacious statement. Such material progress was not only possible, but desirable, which of course is not obvious. A lot of people who today would argue that yes, growth is possible, but we don't want any more of it. And finally, that material progress can be achieved by the expansion of useful knowledge. That is to say, the main driver of economic growth is improvements in knowledge, improvements in science and technology. But they did more. The men and women of the Enlightenment not only, supported and disseminated these propositions, they actually themselves undertook research and tried to invent things that were considered useful. I mean, we think of people like Joseph Priestley, an English philosopher who also is famous for having invented sparkling water, for which we are ever thankful, or Benjamin Franklin, an American, of course, but he thought of himself as English most of his life, who, of course, invented the lightning rod. My favorite example, actually, is by now, I think, fairly obscure man. This is him. I'm sure nobody recognizes him. They all look the same with these long, wigs. But this is René Reaumur. These are his dates, 1683 to 1757. He was trained as a mathematician, very much, a good example of the French Industrial Enlightenment. He was trained as a mathematician. He was president of the Académie Royale, but he was interested in many pragmatic and practical things. This is obviously somebody who is very knowledgeable, wants to improve things. Now, most of his things were not successful, which is why he's sort of forgotten. But he worked on iron and steel. He worked on porcelain and glazing. He worked on egg incubation. He wrote a massive book on entomology, on insects, because of the importance of insects to agriculture. He worked on meteorology. He was in fact the inventor of the Reaumur scale for temperature, which when I was a kid still was used next to Fahrenheit and Celsius. I think is now forgotten. And on and on and on. So this is a sort of a typical Enlightenment guy. well-trained in mathematics, well-trained in the science of his time, but trying to crack pragmatic problems that are important to technology. So that's basically what I mean by the Industrial Enlightenment. And so what kind of factors can we point to in the growth of useful knowledge? And what can we say about these factors today? And is it reasonable to sort of plug in the values of today and then predict where technology is going to go? Well, you be the judges of that. So I'm going to work with 4 factors that mattered in the past, one by one. The first is pluralism and competition. Second is what I call artificial revelation. That's not going to mean very much, but I'll explain it. Access costs. And finally, incentives. What's an economist without incentives, right? So incentives for intellectual innovation and what I call a well-defined agenda. So let me walk you through these factors one by one. But basically, the plan is to argue that A, they were historically important, and B, these things hold for today's world a fortiori. So let me go. Pluralism and competition. So why do diversity and pluralism matter to the kind of story that we have? So there's sort of 2 different ways of thinking about this, and this is really sort of 2 flip side of the same coin, but it depends a little bit on the kind of methodology you like. If you are, as many people are in Europe, an evolutionary economist, then basically you would agree with me that creativity is the result of diversity because progress occurs through a process of selection, very much sort of in a Darwinian mode. The more items there are on the cultural menu, the more chance you have to pick some kind of variety that work. The other is the pure sort of neoclassical economic model, which basically says that competition in a world in which many entities compete, progress is more likely to occur because no competitor wants to fall behind, and because those that do not keep up will eventually drop up. That's true for firms. It's equally, of course, true for political units which compete with each other in some kind of competitive political system. Now, these stories are not mutually exclusive, and they both shed light on economic growth and how technological progress started in the 18th century in the West. And if I may be so immodest, this is basically the topic of my new book, which will be coming out with a little bit of luck next year with Princeton University Press. And so one of the arguments that I make in there is that Europe, unlike, say, China, is heavily politically fragmented. Of course, nowhere perhaps more than here in Italy, but in fact it's true all over the European continent. It's broken up into these many political units which in some way or another compete with each other and want to keep up with one another. And so certainly between 1500 and 1700, Europe is subject to this political, cultural, and religious pluralism, which is, of course, a mixed blessing because these nations compete with each other, but not always in a nice way, as the many wars of the period suggest. All the same, fragmentation and competition are clearly forces for progress. Now, this is not a new idea. Here is a quote from one of the great writers of the Enlightenment period, a great historian, Edward Gibbon, who at the very end of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire basically points out the difference between Rome, which was a single political unit for much of its existence, and now he says, well, yeah, but today's world is different, he says. Europe is now divided into 12 powerful, so unequal kingdoms. I'm not sure that number 12 is correct, but never mind that. 3 respectable commonwealths and a variety of smaller, so independent states, blah, 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 blah. And what he says this, the abuses of tyranny are restrained by the mutual influence of fear and shame, and so on and on and on. And then he says, this is obviously sort of a bad time to say this in 1789, but he says, in peace, he says, the progress of knowledge and industry is accelerated by the emulation. Emulation is a wonderful 18th century word. It basically means competition of so many active rivals. In war, the European forces are exercised by temperate and undecisive contests. Well, 1789 is a bad time to say that because it's just on the eve of Napoleon, which the last sentence surely isn't true, but he couldn't have known that. Now here, on the same topic, is my favorite Enlightenment writer, and I cannot ever not quote him. This is the man I'm thinking about. You all recognize him. David Hume. Nothing is more favorable, he says, to the rise of politeness. Politeness is a sort of 18th century expression. It means more than politeness. It means sort of civilization, culture, progress, and learning than a number of neighboring and independent states connected together by commerce and policy. The emulation, again, emulation, which naturally arises among those, is an obvious source of improvement, blah, 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 blah. The divisions into small states are favorable to learning by stopping the progress of authority as well as that of power. So this is very much a view of that people in the 18th century had. And of course, there's nothing in modern economics that isn't consistent with that. The competitive model is a reasonably good approximation for the behavior of these political entities in the 17th century, many of which encouraged and even supported scientific and technological advances, not out of altruism, not even out of a sense of, gee, we want to make our citizens better off. That's not uppermost on their mind, but basically to keep ahead of the guy next door. Okay, so if you are Peter the Great of Russia, you're not worried about the welfare of the average Russian, which he didn't give one hoot about. He was worried about King Charles XII of Sweden, who was threatening his realm. What's more, it's actually stronger than that, because not only that you have competition between nations, but also there's competition within nations, because the notion that these political units like Spain or France are in fact united, that's a myth. Within each of those units there is competition between different regions, between different cities, between groups, different groups. None more so perhaps than in my birth country, the Netherlands, which is the united provinces, but they're not all that united. They're competing with each other quite hard. So this competitive model applies everywhere. Moreover, if you think of that in evolutionary terms, very much the same, but it's important to realize here that you have competition also within different items on the cultural menu. And so what happens is that a lot of new cultural varieties are being proposed on the menu from which people could choose. So of course the biggest one we all know about, is the Reformation. All of a sudden, so to speak, after 1517, every European could choose if he wanted to be a Catholic or a Protestant, and a little bit later there were varieties of Protestants. Now, that's obviously a simplification. You couldn't really choose. If you lived in a particular city that was Catholic, it could be dangerous to be a Protestant and vice versa, but people could move and did, and so on. But it's not just in religion. In medicine, sort of the old humoral theory that had come down since the days of Galen and Hippocrates, all of a sudden has to compete with a new school called the iatrochemical school, founded by the great physician Paracelsus. In physics, you see competition between different schools, okay? Cartesianism versus Newtonianism, for instance, or the atomic theory competing with vitalism, and they're both competing with Aristotelianism. All of a sudden, there is a competition between different groups. And so what makes this market so competitive is clearly well understood. We have a printing press after 1450. There is a growth, very strong growth of epistolary networks, and the growth of proliferation of many independent universities and non-academic institutions that emerged in the 17th and 18th century, such as the Accademia dei Lincei, of course, here in Italy, the Académie Royale in France, the Royal Society in England, and on and on and on. And so this is happening in a world in which courts and universities, many kingdoms and cities and principalities are competing to attract the best and the brightest. Now, when they attract the best and brightest, it's of course not just scientists and engineers that they're competing for. They're competing for the best composers, for the best painters, for the best jesters. I mean, you name it, everybody wants to attract the best. That's competition, of course. Now, on the other hand, of course, we have scholars and intellectuals who are competing with one another for the best patronage positions. Because patronage, that is to say, getting some kind of economic security is what all of those intellectuals want. And so, if I may cite to you the Talmud here, the jealousy of learned man will increase wisdom. And that's, in many ways, the summary of the competitive model that's true for them. So what comes out, of course, is a very new world. It leads to breakthroughs in science and technology and eventually to the Industrial Revolution. Now, what about today? I submit to you that the world today is more pluralistic and competitive than ever. Now, of course, Europe as a whole may have become a little bit less competitive because we have the EU, I hope, for the long run. But of course, even if Europe itself may have become less competitive, and France and Germany, say, are now buddies as opposed to, mortal enemies, which they'd been for, 200 years before 1945, we, of course, living in an age of globalization. And so the world is divided up into, 5 or 6 blocks that are competing with one another. We have the European bloc and the North American bloc and China, and then maybe with a little bit of luck, one day Africa and the Middle East and India. So, there are these 5 or 6 blocks which compete with each other just as much as the European units did in the 17th and 18th century. Except, of course, that things today are vastly better. Globalization has not created a homogeneous world. It has created a world that is more competitive. And so different cultures create different kinds of innovation. But globalization means, of course, that all players that are in the game have instantaneous access to what their competitors do. And so, there's some kind of rough division of labor between we have, American genetic modification and German chemistry, Israeli software, Chinese advances in acupuncture and moxibustion, among many others. So, the way I think the world is different today, and that means it's going to be faster and stronger, is that if an invention is made somewhere, it's made everywhere. Because diffusion through modern communication is immediate. It doesn't have to be loaded on a ship and sail around the Cape of Good Hope. And so things are faster. Factor number 2, artificial revelation. I promised I'd explain it. So what is artificial revelation? Ask yourself, what drives scientific advances at any time? So, of course, you can give a long list of many factors. But what is often neglected is that science depends on technology because scientists need tools and instruments to do their work. And so technological progress helps and stimulates scientific advances no less than the reverse is true. And the reason, of course, that this is so important is because our human senses are too limited for much of nature, right? So nature operates at scales and frequencies and distances and bandwidths that we cannot observe with our naturally given senses, and we can only observe them through what the great historian of science, Derek Price, called artificial revelation. To that I should add, by the way, that it isn't just observation, but also computation. So our brains simply are limited. Even if you're the greatest mathematical genius, you cannot do more than I don't know how many flops a minute, and machines can make a joke out of that. So we need tools to do science. And I can give you no better example than what happened in the 17th century. Because what was known as the scientific revolution is, of course, driven by new tools and instruments. So the best known examples, and I will not elaborate on them because everybody knows them, are the great trio, the telescope, the microscope, and the barometer, all developed in the early 17th century, and they play a major role, and everybody knows the famous story about Galileo and the moons of Jupiter and so on. So instead of dwelling on what everybody knows, let me give you 3 slightly lesser known examples, so many of you will know them as well, from the area to drive the point home. So this is Boyle's famous air pump. So the air pumps were one of the great advances of the 17th century, and it is quite important because, of course, Aristotle had basically denied the existence of a vacuum. And, here were a bunch of people saying, Aristotle, in all due respect, he was wrong. In fact, he was wrong on many things, and that is very much part of the story. But the vacuum is particularly important because, of course, the first steam engines, built in the late closing decade of the 17th century, are vacuum machines. If you don't understand that a vacuum is possible, you'll never try to build a steam engine. You need somebody to tell you a vacuum is possible. Voila! This proves it, and from there we get our first steam engines, and of course from there it's history. Here's something else. This is Voltas Battery. This is the first battery ever built by anybody in 1800. I suppose they don't teach that in Italian high schools. I don't know what they teach, but this is a great achievement of Italian civilization, Alessandro Voltas Battery. What is interesting, of course, is that as a battery it was completely useless because there was nothing to run it on, since it was the first battery ever built. But what was fairly quickly realized is that this instrument could be used for chemistry. Now, modern chemistry had basically just emerged in the previous decades, given the work of Antoine Lavoisier, and chemists started to use electrolysis using the battery, particularly an Englishman called Humphrey Davy, to essentially differentiate between elements and compounds, and filled in much of the content of the contour that Lavoisier and Dalton and others had sketched. And so this is basically a tool without which modern chemistry would not have developed the way it did. Here's a third one, which I like very much. This is not, of course, the first microscope ever built, but this is a major improvement to the microscope. The man's picture there is a man called Joseph Lister, not the famous surgeon, but his father, but he invented what's known as the achromatic microscope that minimizes both chromatic and spherical aberration. Now, why is that important? It's because it is this type of microscope, ladies and gentlemen, that makes the greatest advance in medical technology of all times possible, namely the discovery by Louis Pasteur, Robert Koch, and others that infectious diseases were directly linked to identifiable microorganisms, which we call the germ theory, without which modern medicine would be nowhere. But it would be nowhere if these people had not been able to use the improved microscope, because the microscopes used in the 17th century just were not powerful enough. So basically, better research tools made for better science, and better science makes for better technology. So what about our own age? Well, it seems really sort of storming through an open door to point out that the science toolkit has grown enormously in the past decades. And so I'm going to give you 2 or 3 examples, but I could make this, 150, and so could anybody in this room. But let me start with telescopy, just in honor of Galileo. So Galileo never had this, okay? This is the European Extremely Large Telescope that uses something called adaptive optics. It's used from the ground, so it's not like the Hubble. But here is what it can do, okay? So these are 2 pictures of the planet Uranus. The one on the left is made with an ordinary telescope. The one on the right is made with adaptive, which is basically computer controlled with about 1,000 adjustments a second or something like that, and that is still in the process of being improved. So it is as good as the Hubble and a hell of a lot cheaper, okay? And so that's basically a point about just one single tool. Now, here in honor of Pasteur, Pasteur never had this. This is a Betzig-Hell type of stimulant emission depletion microscope, for which they gave the Nobel Prize, I think 2 years ago, if I recall correctly. It essentially allows you to see things that we never imagined we could see, not even with electronic microscopes. And this is sort of the fundamental tool, or a class of tools, that is used in nanotechnology, which actually is quite a big deal at my university at Northwestern. Okay. So here's another instrument, very different. These are automatic gene sequencing machine in which we can, you can sequence, hundreds of genes a day instead of spending, a month on each. These were developed at Leroy Hood's laboratory in Caltech. And the most revolutionary, perhaps of all, also in Europe, I know this is controversial, but I'm living in the United States, This is essentially these are the people who, for the first time, realized the possibility of inserting genetic material from one species into another to bring about heterologous gene expression, or what is now known as genetic engineering or genetic modification. This is now advanced in a new stage, and this is something you probably all have heard of. This is the new technology in which we can vastly improve the degree of gene editing, known as a technique called CRISPR. This is the inventor Jennifer Doudna, and this will revolutionize the way we do genetics. And basically, the way CRISPR works is essentially sort of find and replace function. Its technological possibilities are absolutely unbelievable. Get rid of, say, 6,000 genetic diseases from common ones like Tay-Sachs and sickle cell anemia to fairly rare diseases, basically by slightly editing the human genome. What is interesting for me, however, is not just what it can do to people, which will be controversial and a matter of bioethics, but basically in redesigning organisms, perhaps unlimited. Now, I want to remind everybody that humans have redesigned animals and plants since humanity began. As I tell my students, God did not create poodles. We did. The corn on the cob that you eat is not found in nature. This is the result of artificial selection. It just is done very slowly over many generations. Now we can do it fast. So here's fresh off the press. This came out 3 days ago. And this is an attempt, it seems to be a successful attempt, to use this technique basically to change the genetic makeup of mosquitoes. So the mosquitoes that carry malaria, okay, can be modified with genes from mosquitoes that do not carry malaria. And the idea is to destroy malaria, not by killing all the mosquitoes, because that actually is an invasive thing that may have fairly strong repercussions to the ecosystem, but just to reduce their capability of carrying the protozoa that causes malaria. So those of you interested, this is a Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences paper published a few days ago that points out this work. And they are actually using precisely this CRISPR technology. And so the New York Times had a long article this Saturday on a slightly different topic, which is that using this technique to raise cows that have no horns. You'd think, well, you know, why would you care? Well, you care because it's actually an expensive and painful process to dehorn cows, but some cows don't have horns sort of genetically, and so what you're trying to do is make all cows without horns. It seems rather interesting idea. Now, I fully understand that genetic modification is a concern to bioethicists, and its application to people is something on which I will not express an opinion. But what is, of course, critical is that we can redesign, or we will be in a position to redesign, basically every plant and every animal on this planet, thanks to these techniques. And that's non-trivial, because we are facing, whether you like it or not, a period of not just climate change, but growing water scarcity and higher variance in rainfall, temperature, and so on. And the only way we can survive is to make our plants and animals, resilient to these fluctuations. And this is, I think, the way to do it. Finally, of course, the tool that makes all science possible is the computer. So I cannot think of a single field of human inquiry that hasn't been affected by the computer. There is no field that I know of in my university or any other university where you don't see computers sitting all over. The real question that people ask me today is, and I'm old enough to remember, how did you guys ever do any research before you had computers? Good question. What I'm interested in is not what computers do to production directly, which is a huge field, but to remember that it also has an indirect loop through its effect on science and scientific research, and from there to technology. And so they allow research that was simply impossible before. In chemistry, for instance, multiscale models of complex chemical systems that allow the solution of the complex equations of quantum chemistry. In physics, the old age problem of turbulence, which had been known for many years to be governed by these partial differential equations called the Navier-Stokes equation, which are very, straightforward, except they have no solution, except that no closed form solution. They can be, of course, simulated, but the simulation requires a lot of computing power. We're moving in that direction. We're not quite there yet. In material science, we are reaching a stage in which we can experiment with materials in silico, that is to say on the screen, rather than actually have to play with them in a lab. So the important point is that as new tools create better science, that science then feeds back into technology, this time with enormous power. And so what you get is this fantastic positive feedback loop that will continue to diverge and will not ever, I think, converge to anything. So a different way of thinking about it is, in some sense, technology pulls itself up by the bootstraps through the intermediation of science. Technology creates more technology, not just by allowing different techniques to recombine, but by basically increasing our understanding of the fundamental physical, chemical, and biological processes at work in our techniques. And so it's important to realize that, because there's a lot of talk about what the digital revolution does to consumption and production, and we have people asking us questions. Can we ever really build a robot that can make coffee, drive trucks, pick tomatoes, babysit for infants? But the important part is this. It's information technology affects science, and through that it affects other technologies, and that I think is critical. So here's one example which I picked here up in Milan from the French Expo in the 2015 pavilion, okay? And that is a very sort of imaginative way of using digital technology to assist evolutionary selection. So this is not genetic modification, but it's basically speeding up Darwinian selection. And what they have is sort of high throughput phenotyping platforms that are equipped with robots and cameras, and then allow them to detect genes that are better adapted in some way to our environmental needs and to human demand. So these platforms can do a lot of stuff, and they can sort thousands of individual plants by automated means on a daily basis. So essentially we should think of this as a Darwinian machine, if you want, but it does not involve genetic modification, which I understand in Europe people have qualifications about. It only relies on natural mutations, but it picks them up very quickly. Okay? All right. That's factor 2. Factor 3, access costs. Let me explain what I mean and then give you some examples. What does it mean when we say society knows something, or it is known that? Okay, well, the only way I can ever define that is that social knowledge is the union of the knowledge of all the individuals in society. Okay, so when exactly 100 years ago Einstein submitted his famous paper, that's exactly 100 years ago, on relativity, at some point relativity was known only to one person, right? It was only known to Einstein. And then it was known to the editor of the journal. And then it was known to the referees of the journal. And then the paper came out, and it was known to maybe the 100 people who could at first understand it. And then, of course, it spread out, okay? But once it's known to one person, it's known to society, because it's the union of all knowledge, okay? That's basically the point. So I'm told, and this may be right, people here may correct me, okay, that there are only about 10,000 people in the world who really understand Schrödinger's equations. About half of them are at Caltech. That may not be true, but but it's important, of course, that if knowledge exists in society, that people who don't actually have that knowledge can access it in some way, either by asking the people who know, or reading their books, or looking it up somewhere, somehow. Okay? And that's what I mean, accessed. The point about access, of course, is it's costly. I mean, if I don't know something, it is costly for me to try to find out. And so, so why is this cost so important? Why is this access so important? Well, part of it, of course, is that invention often requires access to best science available. That may not be enough. Scientists may not know everything there is to know, but at least you want to make sure that you're not trying to do something that cannot be done by best standards of science today. And I would like to add, that even if science doesn't provide you with the answers, and it doesn't precisely show you where to go, it is always true what Louis Pasteur said, which is that fortune is important, but fortune favors the prepared mind. So you have to know some science just to recognize what it is that good luck threw your way. It's also true, of course, that ideas never work alone. As the famous journalist Matt Ridley has remarked, technology advances by ideas having sex with one another. So if you have one idea, it often helps to have access to a partner. And finally, you need to have access because you don't want to reinvent the wheel. So a lot of research exists of duplicating and reinventing wheels. But if you know what's out there, you may know what is already known and not try to do it over again. So what determines these costs, these access costs? So there are many factors, but clearly the most important one is the technology of storing codified information and searching through it, which is sort of central to the story. And so in the past, what were the most important advances in information storage and search engine technology? Now, of course, you can think of the invention of writing, and then the invention of paper many centuries later, and then the invention of the printing press in the 15th century. These were all very important in storing information. But what is, of course, critical is that it's not enough that knowledge is stored. It has to be organized. If you have to have access that is fast and cheap, it has to be organized so that searches are efficient. And what is interesting is that the age of enlightenment that preceded the Industrial Revolution basically created new ways of accessing information, both in what they call codified and what is known as tacit knowledge. And maybe all I'll say is that the paradigmatic document of the 18th century Enlightenment is the encyclopedia. An alphabetization of encyclopedias and indexes of technical books, these are maybe the Googles of their age. They wouldn't understand that sentence, but it's we understand today. And the paradigmatic Enlightenment document is of course, the Grande Encyclopédie, edited by d'Alembert and Diderot, which we all know and love. So here's one picture from it, just for the heck of it, to show you that this isn't just about human rights and religious tolerance. It is about how to make things, ladies and gentlemen. This is the famous picture of Epinglier, the making of pins, which is supposedly to have inspired the first chapter of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nation about the division of labor. You can sort of see there's a fair amount of sort of technical information about how to make it. Now, this encyclopedia and many others like it that came out in the 18th century, which I've read a good deal, basically give, and they're fairly boring stuff, but it tells you how to make things. If you lived in 1770 and you wanted to know the latest technology in soap boiling or beer brewing or brick making or lens making, this is where you would go. It was available. And you didn't have to read the whole thing because it was arranged alphabetically. It is therefore cutting access costs. And so, if you plug it into today, what do we have? Well, if information and communication technology has done anything at all, it's reduced access costs. We no longer deal with data. Who cares about data? We have big data. We have mega data. Amazing quantities of information that allow you really to search, for, needles that are nanoscopic in size, in haystacks the size of Montana, essentially instantaneously. You just hit that search button and it looks over a mind-boggling amount of information to pick out exactly what you're looking for. Or if it doesn't pick out what you're looking for, you haven't posed the right question. Now, this has, of course, like many things, it has a negative side. Information allows us both spies and advertisers perhaps know more about us than they should. But for further scientific research and technological advances, the implications are huge. Because anybody engaged in research can access vast banks of knowledge of information. The scientific storages are no longer measured in petabytes, which is more than gigabytes, but we have zettabytes, which is 1 million petabytes, and yottabytes, which are 1,000 zettabytes, and then there's also brontobytes. I forget how many but it's a lot. You know, I mean, these are numbers that can only be described in 10 to the something 20 or something like that. And what's more, this information moves across the planet in seconds, and so the cross-fertilization of ideas in one place or another that used to take years or centuries now happens in minutes. You should have said seconds. And so we have these fantastic databases, in economics, you know how fantastic it is. But you look at something like PubMed, and essentially free of charge, with no physical effort, at the click of the mouse, you can find any paper written about any subject. I mean, Louis Pasteur, didn't have it that good, right? He had to go to the library and spend, half a day on the shelves. What is true for medical science is true for any research field. I mean, you just search through the literature and you find what you're looking for in seconds. This is, compared to that, the encyclopedia is just the beginning. All right. Factor 4, incentives. Now, what's an economist without incentives, right? We love incentives. But in the generation of science, incentives are a problem, which economists have known for a very long time. Because knowledge really can't be readily owned or sold the way other assets are owned and sold, right? And the reason is sort of obvious. Knowledge is a classic public good in the sense that, A, if I have some and I give it to you, I don't have any less, right? In that sense, it's much like fire, but it's more than that. Once I give it to you, I lose control because I have no way of preventing you of giving it to others. And so, in that sense, it can't be owned unless I keep it in my drawer, in which case it does no good to me, right? And so, how do we incentivize people to create new knowledge? Well, this is a problem that economists have known about basically since Kenneth Arrow's classic papers and have been, And what I'd like to submit to you is that between 1500 and 1700, Europe found a solution. And the solution basically deals with reputations. So, being the inventor of a new idea or the discoverer of a new idea gives you a reputation. And that reputation then, in some ways, provides you with a patronage position. So that patronage position could be, of course, a position at a court where you would be kept by some prince or some king as the local scientist, or, of course, a patronage position was, as it is today, a tenured position at a university, both of which are based on reputation. So the famous classical case is, of course, what happened to Galileo after he publishes his famous Sidereus Nuncius. And, a few months later, so to speak, his telephone rang, and there was the Prince Duke of Florence who said, "Would you like a job at my court, at 4 times the salary and no teaching?" Well, how many academics do you know that would turn down a thing like that? But that was based on reputation. But in fact, Galileo is not the only example. One can think of Leibniz, who was, the court, I don't know what he was, a court wise man, I guess, at the King of Hanover, and Newton, who became master of the mint, and, Christian Huygens, who was invited to the French Académie Royale, and on. So the superstars of the age clearly got patronage positions based on their reputation as the superstars of the age. And so basically, the way it worked is a classic incentive mechanism. You discover something, you get others to notice, you become famous, and then you're set for life. You may not be all that rich, but most of the people who are in the business of creating knowledge don't care about being very rich. They want to be secure so that they don't have to worry about where their bread is coming from while they're doing their research. You know, academia basically still works on that principle until the very day. And so it's not perfect, in part because the reputation mechanism that we have, it can be made perfect, and anybody who's ever gone through the peer review process knows that, of course, the system is full of holes, but it's probably the best we can do, and it's worked reasonably well. All right, what about today? Well, this is an age in which I think we still richly reward and honor successful inventors and scientists. Now, most of the people who engage in the creation of useful knowledge only capture a minute portion of the social surplus. It's been estimated that about 98% of the social surplus created by innovation accrue not to the person who generates it, but to consumers or to other firms. But we still find ways of respecting and rewarding these scientists, and most of them still prefer being famous to being rich. Now, we also have, of course, a patent system, which in some ways is a different solution to this system. And there's lots of wrong with the patent system here and in the United States. It still does create, I think, a major ex-ante incentive for innovators. But clearly, what counts for the vast bulk of people who create new knowledge is economic security through tenure jobs, first mover advantages, prizes, medals, things like that. And these incentives have worked. Except, of course, globalization today creates global superstars instead of sort of local superstars. And, of course, winning a Nobel Prize, which is the summum summarum of these things, it means more than a few Swedish kroners and dinner with the king. It means basically global celebrity status. I know a few people who won the prize in economics, and, you know, clearly the money itself is secondary to the fact that from then, you know, as somebody says, they never travel coach again. All right, so one final thought that I think is important. Science and technology advance most rapidly when the world poses them with well-defined and sometimes urgent problems that need a solution now. And of course, the implication is that those who solve them will be rewarded in the way I already noticed. And of course, it has to be within the capabilities of society. And so, these well-defined problems are what Nate Rosenberg has called focusing devices. Okay? Everybody understands this problem needs to be solved now. This is on the agenda. So, the 18th century had 5 problems it needed to solve. It probably had more. These are 5 I picked, you know, somebody here can think of others. But these are 5 problems that basically every student of the Industrial Revolution knows about. 1, how to pump water out of coal mines. I mean, this may sound trivial, but let me tell you, if you were in a coal mine in England that could be flooded any moment, you would think that this would be a rather important problem. And basically, the steam engine was invented to do just that. The first 50 years of its existence, it was used exclusively as a pump in coal mines, where, of course, the fuel was cheap because it's right on a coal mine. How to spin high-quality cotton yarn inexpensively. I mean, this also may sound trivial, but remember that spinning or that twisting of yarn had been done since the beginning of humanity using these 2 tools, you know, the index finger and the thumb. The question is, can you find a machine that would substitute for human fingers? That turns out to be a hard problem. The age solved it. That's classic to the cotton industry in the Industrial Revolution. How to turn pig iron into wrought iron, an old problem that was quite difficult to solve and on which many people worked for a long time, was solved in 1785 by a man called Henry Court. A very different one, how to fight smallpox. 18th century is obsessed by smallpox. And smallpox became apparently more virulent in the late 17th century because of some mutation. Not only did it kill a lot of people, but even people who weren't killed by it were what known as pockmarked. So they had scars all over their faces, and, you know, this obviously was considered to be a major issue. It is a problem the age solved because they were focused on it. Now, they didn't remember how they solved it. They did not understand the virology. They did not understand the immunology. They saw some empirical regularity, and they go, bingo, this is what we do. You know, you get Edward Jenner's vaccination process in 1796. Before that, of course, they're using inoculation. But they solved the problem. The fifth one, how to solve the problem of measuring longitude at sea. Again, incentives, well recognized. Here's the British Admiralty promises a prize of £20,000 sterling, a huge amount, to whoever could solve the problem. Lots of people work on it. One guy figured it out. And John Harrison clock 1761 allows you to measure longitude at sea. By the time of the French Revolutionary Wars, ships have it. And they no longer have to sort of do things like dead reckoning and other very inaccurate. So if you're at sea and you want to know where you are, right? That sort of seems obvious. But this is how they solved it. So these were 5 problems, well posed, solved at the time. Now, they did not solve other problems that were beyond them. They were trying to use electricity, but they couldn't do it until much later. They were trying to make cheap steel. It took them many more decades. But the problems that were within their reach, they solved. 20th century, of course, I can make this list even longer. Think about the various issues that were well defined and needed a solution. Nitrogen fixing, solved in 1912 by the Haber-Bosch process. Project Manhattan, I need to say nothing more. Polio vaccines, I mean, we can go on and on. But when there's a well-defined problem, people put their mind to it, they solve it. Now, what about our own age? Well, we have some well-defined problems. I made a list of them. I'm sure other people have different lists, but think of it what you want. Of course, top of all is global warming and climate change, the issue of the day, so to speak. Somewhat less well known, also people in the room here surely know it, is what is known as global warming's evil twin, which is ocean acidification, which is the result of very similar factors, but actually may be just as harmful to the planet as climate change. And finally, desertification and growing freshwater scarcity, which will be a problem in large parts of the world more and more. Then there's multi-drug resistance to antibiotics, issues of energy storage and transmission, I can go on and on, digitally driving mass customization, something which as we know is 3-dimensional printing, fish and seafood depletion. I mean, the oceans are running out of fish. I hope that's not news to anybody here. It's something we have to fix if we want to keep eating fish. Maybe a second-order problem for some people, but not if you have a sushi restaurant. Growing obesity, more of a problem in the United States than in Europe, but more and more of a problem in Europe as well. Mental deterioration with age, well, that's sort of a rich people's problem, but clearly as we live longer and we are more and more able to keep the human body going by using, artificial hips and artificial knees and, cataract surgery and hearing aids and on and on and on, the one thing we haven't been gotten very good at is keeping the human brain going and, improving things like mental deterioration and Alzheimer. This is a problem that we will need to solve if life expectancy will, as it's supposed to go, keep going up. And finally, I'm not sure how much of a problem this is. The problem for me is information overload. And that's sort of the flip side of lowering access cost is not, everything is so accessible that you have information overload, and we need sorting and evaluation machines to do all this. Okay, so my sense is that both the supply and the demand are there. We have the tools to solve most of these problems. I don't know about Alzheimer's, but the others we surely do. The one concern, of course, is that institutions and political factors may get in the way in many places and block advances that are technically possible, as institutions are likely to do. But the good news is that in some ways it doesn't matter, because the way the world is set up today is that even if some countries, for one reason or another, do not want to pursue a particular technology because it goes against their philosophy or against their ethics, it will just done be somewhere else. And so if the Europeans do not like genetic modification, they're not going to stop it. It will just happen in the United States, and eventually, I think, it may take a little bit of a while, but eventually it will take place everywhere. If the Americans don't like cloning, somebody else will be doing cloning. If not in Europe, then in the Caribbean or in Mozambique or in who knows where. But the point is, because the world is so fragmented, okay, you cannot stop any technology. You can just slow things down. Once it's solved in one place, the knowledge will be spread almost instantaneously everywhere. And so, is this an unqualified optimistic scenario? And the answer, of course, is no. The world is not getting to be a better place apart from technology. I mean, war and various institutional issues, and certainly in the last 10 years, haven't gotten much better. I remember in 1990, when the Cold War was over, people thought, oh my God, this is the end of history. Remember Francis Fukuyama's book, The End of History? Well, the Cold War is over, everything else. It turns out, unfortunately, that is not the case. And there is still a growing imbalance between our technological and our political capabilities, which is a huge threat. Nobody put this better than Sigmund Freud in the last paragraph of Future of His Illusion, when he said, while mankind has made continual advances in its control over nature and may be expected to make even greater ones, indeed, it is not possible to establish with certainty that a similar advance has been made in the management of human affairs. That must be the understatement of the millennium. So let me sum up. We are not like the late Roman Empire or Qing China. We are not about to languish into an age of decline or secular stagnation or anything like that, to be followed by chaos and barbarism and a new medieval age or anything like that. Technological progress is still very remote from reaching a ceiling or even diminishing returns, and in fact may never do so. And economic growth in an economically meaningful way, if not necessarily in a traditional national income accounting way, which is something I haven't talked about, but I'm willing to answer questions about, will continue, and with it, living standards and things correlated with it will continue to improve. And secular stagnation, to me, seems to be an unlikely scenario. Indeed, the digital age will be to the analog age what the Iron Age was to the Stone Age. And we can't even imagine what the post-digital age will look like. No more, I think, than Archimedes could have imagined CERN. Thank you.